Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're plunging into something really fascinating, looking at the complex landscape inside us.
Our inner world.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
We're
yeah.
exploring these different aspects, or I guess the source calls them parts, right?
That's the term, yeah. Parts that make us who we are and how they all interact.
And it's all based on this really compelling chapter on mapping our inner systems.
So it is. It gives such a clear way, a framework, really, for thinking about all those different voices and feelings, those impulses we all experience inside.
So our mission here for this deep dive is really to give you a kind of shortcut to understanding that framework.
Yeah, unpacked it a bit.
We want to get into the core distinctions between these key types of inner parts. You mentioned exiles, protectors, figure out why they end up in these roles, and how their interactions really shape our day-to-day experience and maybe our behavior too.
It's a really dynamic interplay.
Okay, let's get into this map then. Where do we start?
Well, at the sort of highest level, the sources divide our inner landscape into two main categories,
Okay.
exiles and protectors. That's kind of the fundamental split we see in how these parts function.
Right. Exiles and protectors. Let's tackle exiles first. Who are they? What does that mean?
Exiles are often the younger parts of us. You can think of them like our inner children.
Okay, like little kids inside?
Sort of. And in their natural state, before things get difficult, they're the source of so much good stuff. Playfulness, creativity, trust, innocence.
Yeah.
They're very open, very sensitive.
Wow, so they hold some really precious qualities then.
Absolutely. Our core vulnerability, our capacity for joy and wonder
All right.
often resides there.
There's a but, right. They called exiles for a reason.
Exactly. Because they're so sensitive, they're also the parts that tend to absorb the most extreme beliefs and emotions when things go wrong.
Like from trauma. Or difficult childhood experiences.
Yeah, trauma, attachment injuries, feeling really hurt, betrayed, shamed, or scared. These young parts soak up intense burdens from those experiences.
Burdens. And that changes them.
It's a huge shift. A part might go from a natural state of feeling, say, I am loved or I am okay, to being completely swamped by a burden like I am worthless or nobody loves me.
Wow, that's heavy. A total paradigm shift for that part.
It really is. And when an exile like that blends with us, that means their feelings and beliefs kind of flood our whole system.
And you feel it completely.
Right. Their burdened state becomes our reality in that moment. It feels overwhelming, and it can pull us right back into the past, into that original pain.
And naturally, our instinct is often to just push that away, right? That intense feeling.
Yes, absolutely. We try to move on. We try to lock it away. We exile them internally.
Because it just feels unbearable to keep feeling that.
Exactly. We think we're just moving on, being strong. But the tragedy, as the source points out, is that we inadvertently lock away their positive qualities, too.
Oh, right. The joy, the creativity.
Yeah, that intense joy, the capacity for awe, spontaneity. We lose access, and we might even mistakenly think that losing those things is just a normal part of growing up, of becoming an adult.
And culture doesn't exactly help us hold on to those parts, does it?
Yeah.
The sources mention that.
No, it often reinforces the exiling. There's the idea of the monomind paradigm.
The what no mind.
Monomind. Like
Yeah.
the idea that we're just one single consciousness. It doesn't really leave room for thinking about distinct inner parts that might be hurt but could potentially heal. And then you have cultural narratives like, American rugged individualism.
Oh, yeah. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps.
Right. Just get over it. Move on.
Stop being so sensitive. You hear that sometimes.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And for these young, vulnerable, hurting parts, hearing messages like that, it just adds, as the source says, insult to injury.
So they feel abandoned twice over, kind of. Internally and externally.
Exactly. Which makes them pretty desperate.
Desperate to be heard.
Desperate to be attended to be healed. They'll look for any opportunity to break out of that inner prison.
When might that happen?
Often when we're tired or feeling unsupported, or if something happens in the present that just vaguely reminds us of the original pain that can trigger them.
So even when they're locked away, they're still influencing things.
Oh, absolutely. Unconsciously, they have a massive impact on our self-esteem, who we're drawn to romantically, our career choices.
And maybe those times we overreact to something small.
That's often an exile's burdened feelings flooding the system. The reaction feels way out of proportion to the current situation because it's carrying all that past pain.
And the sources say, basically, everyone has these. It's hard not to.
It's incredibly hard to grow up in this world without accumulating some exiles. And of course, for survivors of significant abuse or trauma, there are often many.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, you also mentioned another type of exile, Something about protectors.
Yeah, this is interesting. Protectors and exile. It sounds a bit contradictory, doesn't it?
It does. How can a protector be in exile?
Well, this refers to parts that aren't necessarily young and vulnerable. They might be parts that were naturally quite lively, maybe strong, assertive, maybe even protective in a healthy way,
But
but they didn't fit in. Maybe in our family, those energies weren't welcome. Too loud, too angry, too intense, too something.
so parts we learn to hide to get approval.
Kind of. The sources use this great metaphor from Robert Bly about a child sensing their parents don't like certain parts of them, so they put those parts into an invisible bag and drag it behind them just to keep their parents' love.
Wow. Stuffing parts of ourselves away.
Exactly. But the problem is, those parts don't just disappear in the bag, they regress, they get neglected. And Bly's quote is powerful. Every part of our personality that we do not love will become hostile to us.
Oof, that's hard. Every part we do not love will become hostile.
It explains a lot. If these exiled protectors are neglected, they can become really angry, resentful, maybe even destructive.
Is this maybe connected to what Freud called the id? That kind of raw, instinctual energy he saw as negative?
It's possible there's a connection, yeah. Unfortunately, that view often led to pathologizing these energies instead of seeing them, like the younger exiles, as parts that are hurt and just need help and understanding.
Okay, so we've got these exiles, young ones carrying pain, maybe some stronger ones we've pushed away. They feel vulnerable. The world seems dangerous.
Right. The whole inner system feels fragile, delicate, maybe constantly under threat.
And that's where the other main category comes in, the protectors.
Exactly.
Right.
When there are a lot of vulnerable exiles, the system feels it can't cope, so other parts have to step up.
Step out of their preferred roles.
Yeah, maybe parts that would naturally be playful or creative or wise or calm. They have to leave those valuable roles behind and take on the job of protecting the system.
Like being drafted into service.
That's a good way to put it. The sources use the image of adolescents being pressed into service as soldiers or police officers, taking on heavy responsibilities before they're really ready.
And their main job is?
Twofold, really. Either try to prevent the exiles from getting triggered in the first place, or deal with the emotional fallout if they do get triggered.
Got it. Prevent or react.
And based on which strategy they use, the sources divide protectors into two main classes.
Okay, what are they?
Managers and firefighters.
Managers and firefighters. Let's break those down. Managers first.
Okay. Managers are all about preemption, control. Their main goal is to manage the outside world.
Outside, like situations, people.
Yeah, relationships, our environment, our own behavior, anything they can control to prevent something from triggering an exile's pain.
So they're the planners, the strategists of the inner world.
Exactly. And the enforcers, too. Their methods can be incredibly varied.
Like what?
Oh, managing relationships, maybe becoming a people pleaser to avoid conflict or becoming controlling. Managing appearance and performance, that relentless inner critic pushing for perfection is often a manager.
The inner critic.
Yeah.
That makes sense as a manager.
Definitely. Or parts that make us take care of everyone else but neglect our own needs. Or parts that make us hyper-vigilant, always scanning for danger.
That sounds exhausting.
It is. Or parts that push us to intellectualize everything, stay up in our heads, disconnected from the body, where those tricky feelings live.
The source uses a phrase, parentified inner children.
Yes. That's such a powerful image for many managers. They're often fundamentally young parts that got burdened way too early with these huge adult responsibilities for keeping the whole system safe.
And they work hard at it.
Non-stop, some of them, especially the vigilant ones, the controllers. They might never really rest. Some even work to numb the body, just to prevent feelings from surfacing at all.
What about those really harsh ones? The self-sabotaging kind?
Yeah, those are tough managers. They often operate from a core belief that the only way to be truly safe is to stay small, stay below the radar, don't risk criticism, don't risk failure, don't risk anything that might trigger an exile's shame or fear.
So they tear you down to keep you safe.
In their distorted view, yes. They might sabotage good feelings or opportunities. They can even co-opt things that seem positive. The sources mention managerial spiritual bypass.
Managerial, spiritual bypass.
Yeah, using spiritual practices only to manage stress or keep a lid on difficult feelings, rather than using them for genuine self-discovery or deeper connection. It serves the manager's goal of control.
So basically, managers tend to dislike anything that feels out of control or makes you feel too good, too open.
That's a pretty good rule of thumb, yeah. They want stability, predictability, safety above all else. Though some managers might focus more on just fitting in, belonging.
Like following the rules, going along with the crowd?
Could be, like maybe going to church every week because it's expected, but not really seeking a deeper personal connection, more just fulfilling the social role. It keeps things predictable.
Okay. So managers, proactive control.
Mm-hmm.
What about the other type? Firefighters.
Firefighters are completely different. They're the reactive crew, the emergency responders.
They don't try to prevent?
No, they swing into action after an exile has already been triggered. When those intense emotions, the pain, the fear, the shame are already bursting out.
Right.
When the manager's defenses have failed.
Right. The fire's already burning. They rush in.
Exactly. And their goal is urgent, desperate, and often really impulsive. Put out that inner fire now. Douse the flames immediately.
How do they do that?
This is where we often see more extreme behaviors. Using substances to get higher than the feelings. Binge eating, compulsive behaviors like gambling or sex, excessive shopping, getting lost in work, zoning out with TV or social media for hours. Anything to distract or numb until the intensity subsides.
And they don't care about the consequences.
Not really, no, not in the heat of the moment. If the fear of the exile's pain is really high, the firefighter will resort to pretty much anything. There's often very little regard for the collateral damage to health, relationships, finances.
The urgency overrides everything.
Completely. The sources even point out that for some parts, in extreme situations where nothing else seems to work to extinguish the unbearable pain, suicide can feel like the only option left.
Wow. That really highlights the desperation involved.
It does. It's not malice. It's sheer desperation to stop the pain.
And the source mentioned spiritual bypassing here too, but maybe in a different way.
Yeah, it's common with firefighters too, using spiritual practices not just to manage, but to escape, to achieve states of transcendence or dissociation, states where you feel far away from the body and the pain.
Like an addiction to spiritual highs.
It can become that, yeah. The firefighter gets the relief it craves, losing control, getting away from the exile's suffering. But the big problem, the sources warn, is that this can leave the exile feeling even more abandoned and alone down there in the dark.
That makes sense. So firefighters can also be like frantically searching for a fix.
Yes. Sometimes they act like desperate babysitters for the screaming exile. They're constantly looking for the next thing, the next teacher, the next workshop, the next relationship, the next self-help book. Anything or anyone that promises to finally make the exile feel better.
Leading to that pattern of jumping from one thing to another.
Exactly. They become recruiters or seekers in that sense, always looking outside for the answer.
And the source connects this firefighter activity to a broader societal thing too, using the term moral injury.
Yeah, that was a really interesting connection. The idea is that living in a world with so much visible suffering, poverty, injustice, environmental destruction, it creates a kind of moral injury if we feel powerless or disconnected from it.
And we need ways to numb that pain.
We often do, yeah. And society provides countless firefighter activities, readily available distractions like drugs, endless media, all-consuming jobs, even certain kinds of detached spiritual leadership that help us numb out from that collective pain or our own sense of unease about it.
Like choosing Netflix over activism, as the author mentioned.
Right, acknowledging that sometimes that choice comes from a firefighter part, just wanting to numb out the overwhelm or the pain of awareness.
Okay, this whole framework,
Yeah.
exiles, managers, firefighters, it really drives home a crucial point you made earlier. These are roles, not the essence of the parts.
That is absolutely the most critical thing to grasp. These categories describe the jobs parts have been forced into because of past hurts and difficult circumstances.
Not who they fundamentally are.
No, their extreme behaviors, their burdens, their being stuck in the past, that's what maintains the role. But it's not their true nature.
And you're saying they can change if the burden is lifted.
Dramatically. When you help a part unburden its pain and extreme beliefs, when you bring it out of the past and into the present, its true qualities emerge. It becomes a resource.
So that hyper-vigilant manager.
Might just want to relax, enjoy peace, maybe use its awareness skills in a calm way.
And the firefighter who binged?
Might have incredible energy for healthy passion, playfulness, creativity, standing up for things. The core energy isn't bad. It was just hijacked by the need to fight the fire.
The source also brings in ideas from systems thinking. Feedback loops, homeostasis. How does that fit?
It adds another layer of understanding. It helps see how these parts interact dynamically. Managers, for example, often act like the thermostats of the system.
Trying to keep things stable. Homeostasis.
Exactly. They try to bring the system back to what they perceive as a safe, stable range. So if you start feeling too good, too confident, maybe risking vulnerability, a critic manager might attack you to bring you back down.
Pulling you back to the set point.
Right. Or if the critic fails, another manager might make you feel exhausted or dissociated, just shut things down to regain control. All burden parts, really, are aiming for some kind of safety or stability, their own version of homeostasis. They just use very different, often problematic strategies.
And firefighters tend to disrupt that stability, maybe create reinforcing loops.
They often do. Their intense reactions can push the system way outside the manager's comfort zone, which then makes the managers clamp down even harder.
Leading to more firefighter reaction.
Exactly. You can get these escalating reinforcing loops. Tighter control leads to bigger rebellion, leads to even tighter control. In extreme cases, that cycle can be really destructive.
But the firefighter's intention is still sort of homeostatic, trying to get the overwhelming feeling back down.
Yeah, usually their immediate goal is homeostatic. Quell the overwhelming emotion, distract until the exiled feelings are back in a range that feels tolerable, even if that range is numb. Their methods, however, often create instability for the managers.
And trying to suppress the exiles themselves also creates loops.
Definitely. The more you try to ignore or numb an exile's pain, often the louder it has to scream to be heard. It's like a small headache turning into a raging migraine because you ignored the first signals. Understanding these system dynamics is so helpful.
How so? What mistakes does it help avoid?
Well, for one, it stops you from just siding with the protectors against the exile's pain because you see it's all interconnected.
Right. Don't demonize the protectors.
And crucially, it helps you anticipate consequences. Like, if you try to rush in and access an exile's deep pain without preparing the system, without working with the protectors first, you can predict there might be a strong backlash.
Like a firefighter reaction.
Exactly. The source emphasizes these inner systems are like delicate ecologies. You have to tread carefully and understand the interactions.
Which leads perfectly into the warnings the source gives about actually working with these parts, especially on your own.
That's a really important point. While doing exercises to get to know your protectors, your managers, your firefighters can often be done safely alone.
Getting close to the exiles is different.
It's much trickier. The raw pain they hold can be incredibly intense. If you're doing an exercise and start to feel overwhelmed, flooded, like you're losing yourself in the emotion,
what should you do?
The advice is clear. Pause. Gently shift your focus out of that intense feeling. Come back to the present moment. Don't push through overwhelm alone.
And for the deeper work, actually helping the exiles heal.
For most people, the source strongly suggests having support, someone present who can stay grounded, stay in what the model calls self.
Self. What's self?
Self is described as our core essence. It's characterized by qualities like calmness, curiosity, compassion, confidence, courage, creativity, connection, and clarity. The 8 C's.
Okay. So someone who can hold that space.
Yeah. Ideally, a therapist trained in this approach, or at least someone you trust who can reliably access those self-qualities. They can provide the safety and guidance needed to approach an exile's pain without the whole system getting flooded or protectors freaking out.
Which brings us to what sounds like the golden rule of this work.
It really is. You must get permission from the protectors before you try to connect with the exiles they guard.
Permission from the inner critic, or the part that wants to binge.
Yes. You have to approach them respectfully. Understand their fears, their reasons for protecting, acknowledge their hard work, build some trust. Explain why you want to help the exile and how it will ultimately make their job easier. You need their okay to proceed.
Why is that so crucial?
Think about it from their perspective. They might have spent decades working 24/7 to keep that exile locked up because they genuinely believe releasing that pain would destroy the system or make things much worse. You can't just storm the castle gates.
You need to be an ecologically sensitive guest, as the source puts it.
Exactly. You need to understand their role in the inner ecosystem, respect their fears, and gain their trust before they'll let you near the vulnerable part they protect.
And apparently the developers of this model learned this the hard way.
They did. The source mentions that early on, when they sometimes tried to bypass protective parts and go straight to the exile's pain,
what happened?
They encountered severe backlash reactions, intense suicidal feelings, overwhelming self-hate, even physical pain, a complete shutdown of trust in the therapist and the process.
Wow. The protectors fighting back.
Essentially punishing the system for what they perceived as a dangerous, reckless move. That experience absolutely cemented the non-negotiable rule. Get permission first. Always.
Okay, this is all making sense theoretically. To make it more concrete, the sources share a case study, right, about Mona.
Yes, Mona's story is really illustrative of these dynamics, including the backlash potential.
Tell us about her situation.
Mona came in with a pretty significant history. She'd had a psychotic break in the past, carried a bipolar diagnosis, was on medication. She was understandably quite afraid, but also really wanted to understand the parts involved in her experiences.
So where did they start with her?
They started gently, asking about the part she identified as her manic part. As she focused on that image, seeing herself trapped in a psych ward during that time, feeling pity for that younger self, something shifted.
A protector showed up.
Yeah. Suddenly a different part took over. A very sleepy, dissociating part. It felt heavy, foggy.
And why was it there?
It was terrified. It believed that connecting with that manic energy would trigger another psychotic break. It was trying to shut things down to prevent that.
So how did they handle that protector? Did they argue with it?
No, not at all. They spoke to it, acknowledged its fear directly, validated its concern, and reassured it that this time there was help present, that they could proceed safely and slowly.
And did that help?
It did. With that reassurance, the sleepy, dissociating part was able to relax its grip just enough.
Allowing Mona to go deeper towards an exile.
Exactly. She then had an image of a giant abyss. Scary at first, but staying curious, staying with it, she saw a hand reaching out from the darkness.
And she took it.
She did. And she found a 4-year-old girl there. Her immediate, spontaneous reaction was just to embrace this little girl and apologize, saying something like, "I'm so sorry I threw you in this hole."
Wow. A direct connection with a lost part.
A very powerful moment, but then almost immediately...
Another protector.
Yeah.
As they started to gently ask what happened to this little girl, a different part jumped in, very firmly. It insisted that whatever trauma happened, it was the girl's fault.
Blaming the victim, echoing past messages, maybe.
Almost certainly. Reflecting beliefs maybe picked up from family or society, like she was somehow responsible for abuse that happened to her.
So they didn't just accept that protector's story.
No. They acknowledged that part, let it know they heard its perspective, but made it clear that right now, the priority was helping the 4-year-old unload her feelings and beliefs without necessarily agreeing with the protector's judgment.
They stayed focused on the exile.
Right. And by staying with the little girl, they found out what happened. She saw a teenager, something happened, the details weren't the focus, and her response was to dissociate. She said she went to sleep.
Connecting back to the sleepy protector they met earlier.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It was a huge insight. That sleepy, dissociating part wasn't just trying to stop the mania now. It had saved her back then by helping her dissociate during the original trauma.
So they could thank that protector. Crucial step. Thanking it for its vital role back then. With that understanding and appreciation, Mona, in her imagination, could fully be with the 4-year-old. She clothed her, brought her image into the present time, and helped that little part release the enormous burden of shame and terror she'd been carrying for so long.
And how did that feel? For Mona, for the parts.
The little girl felt immense relief, happiness. And interestingly, the image of the manic woman from the hospital also saw the little girl was okay now, and she was able to release her frantic, manic energy.
Like healing one part allowed another to shift.
Exactly. And Mona herself had this insight. Maybe her psychosis years ago was somehow related to all these parts trying to process this overwhelming trauma, but getting completely swamped.
It's profound. So she felt better.
Initially, yes. Lighter, relieved. She's even homework just to gently check in with these parts daily.
But the story doesn't end there, does it? You mentioned backlash.
Right. Hours later, completely out of the blue, she was hit with intense suicidal urges.
Oh, wow. After feeling better.
Yes. Which shows how complex these systems are. They couldn't ignore this. They had to address this new part that had shown up.
The suicidal part. What was its deal?
They talked to it directly. It was furious, full of hate, wanting to hurt her. Its core fear seemed to be that Mona would fuck everything up, especially her relationships, because she was incapable of getting the love and connection she needed. It was deeply despairing.
But why did it show up now, with such intensity, after the healing work?
That was the key question. And the part's answer was basically because Mona had exposed herself. By connecting with that vulnerable 4-year-old, she had made herself naked and vulnerable in this part's eyes.
And that felt dangerous to this part.
Extremely dangerous. This protector, it turned out, had really formed back in her 20s, a time when letting her guard down, showing vulnerability, had actually led to significant losses and pain.
So it learned the vulnerability disaster.
Exactly. It developed this rigid strategy. You must be strong, perfect, never show weakness, or you'll lose everything. Its suicidal threat now was its desperate, albeit totally distorted, attempt to force her back into that safe but rigid and lonely mode. It was trying to protect her from the feared consequences of exposure.
It was operating on old programming.
Completely outdated information, but with terrifying intensity because the original fear was so strong.
And understanding that helped when the consultant validated his past fear.
Massively. When the consultant helped Mona see that this part's intention wasn't malicious, but was born out of real fear from the past, and that it was trying desperately to keep her safe now, even through threats, the part felt understood, heard, seen.
And the intensity dropped.
Yes. It felt immense relief. Mona could then connect with it from her own self-energy, feeling compassion, understanding its positive intent, even with the harmful method, and gently updating it about how her life was different now, how she had support, how vulnerability wasn't the same danger it used to be.
And the part's reaction.
It felt relief, cried from exhaustion, imagined holding that fear for decades, and could finally allow itself to be held and comforted by Mona internally.
What a powerful example. So the lesson is,
even when you think you have permission, sometimes a protector, especially maybe a firefighter type focused on immediate threat detection, can still backlash if the overall system doesn't feel safe enough yet after accessing vulnerability.
so don't fight it or get scared.
Don't polarize. Get curious. Ask why it's reacting so strongly. What is it afraid of? That part needs understanding, reassurance about the present, and ultimately compassion and love from your core self.
And it links back to that idea, symptoms aren't flaws, they're part activities.
Exactly. Mona's suicidal urges weren't her being flawed. They were the activity of a terrified protector part. Seeing it that way changes everything. The symptom becomes a direct line, a signal pointing to a part that desperately needs healing.
Okay. And Mona's case also seems to clarify that manager versus firefighter distinction, again, it's not always about the behavior itself.
That's a great point. The source uses drinking as an example.
Right. How does that fit?
Well, if someone gets really hurt or slighted and then goes on a massive binge to numb the pain, that's likely a firefighter reaction, putting out the fire after it started.
Okay. Makes sense.
But if someone maintains a low level of intoxication pretty much all the time, specifically to avoid feeling vulnerable, to prevent potential slights from even landing.
Ah, that's preemptive.
Exactly. That's shifted into a manager strategy, controlling the internal state to prevent triggers. Same behavior drinking, but driven by a different part with a different purpose and timing.
That's a really useful distinction, purpose and timing.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, one last quick thing the sources touched on, related to Mona seeing that child, the whole tricky area of recovered memories.
Yeah, they address that briefly, but importantly. When a part reveals a scene like Mona's 4-year-old in the abyss, is it a literally accurate memory?
Can we know for sure?
The source says, basically, no. We can't know for sure if every detail is historically factual, and maybe it doesn't matter as much as we think.
What's the approach then?
The focus in this model is therapeutic. You work with the part that's holding the image and the intense emotion. You help it tell its story, feel seen, and unburden the feelings and beliefs associated with that scene.
Regardless of perfect accuracy.
Right. Without needing to confirm external facts or necessarily act on the memory in the outside world, unless appropriate and safe. The healing comes from relieving the part's burden, and that happens whether the memory is literal or symbolic of the emotional truth it carries.
Okay, that feels important. So let's try to wrap up this deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground mapping these inner systems.
We have. We've met the key players, you could say.
Right. The exiles, those often young, vulnerable parts carrying the burdens, the pain, the shame from the past.
Mm-hmm. The inner children needing care.
Then the protectors. First, the managers, the proactive ones, the planners, the controllers, the inner critics, trying to keep things stable and prevent pain before it happens.
Always trying to manage the situation, manage us.
And then the firefighters, the reactive ones, the emergency crew, jumping in impulsively when an exile is triggered, trying to douse the flames with distraction, knowing intense behaviors.
Often causing collateral damage in their desperation.
And the absolute crucial takeaway seems to be these are roles, not identities.
Yes. Roles parts were forced into by life experiences, not their true essence. And with understanding, with healing, they can transform. They all have value.
We also really hit on seeing the inner world as this delicate system, an ecology.
Where everything affects everything else.
And that leads to the fundamental rule.
Yeah.
Getting permission, respecting the protectors, understanding their fears, gaining their trust before trying to approach the vulnerable exiles they guard.
Absolutely essential. Mona's story with that intense backlash really underscores why that's so vital. Even with care, systems can react strongly if they feel unsafe.
So this map, it really offers a different lens, doesn't it? And a new way to look inwards.
It really does. So maybe the question for you listening is, how might looking at your own strong reactions, those times you shut down or lash out or feel overwhelmed, how might seeing them through this lens of exiles, managers, and firefighters change how you understand yourself?
Yeah. What might happen if, instead of judging those parts or those behaviors, you actually got curious? If you remember, they're probably just trying to keep you safe, and the only way they know how, maybe based on really old experiences or intense pain, what might shift if you approach them that way?
That's the invitation, really. Something to explore in your own inner landscape.